It is now my honor to introduce you all to Dr. Kathy Monahan, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. So, Kathy, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eve Valera, who is Associate Professor in Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Research Scientist at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's worked in the domestic violence field for over 25 years, and she uses a range of methodologies to understand the neural, cognitive, and psychological consequences of brain injuries from intimate partner violence, with her most recent focus being on transgender women. As a pioneer in the field of IPV-related brain injury, she regularly lectures internationally and has received national and international recognition for her work being featured in news outlets such as NYT Magazine and Forbes. She was an inaugural recipient of the Women Making History Award from Safe Living Spaces, and and has also been the recipient of the prestigious Robert Vogt Founders Award, the Rappaport Research Fellowship in Neurology, Pink Concussion's Domestic Violence Award, and the Anne Klebansky Visiting Scholars Award. She is passionate about raising awareness and educating all relevant stakeholders about this tremendously overlooked public health problem. Please welcome Dr. Eve Valera, who will talk about concussions plus intimate partner violence, understanding the injuries and correlates of IPV-related brain injury.
Thank you, Kathy. You are actually also one of the pioneers here, so it's very appropriate that you're introducing me. We were putting out papers around the same time, and it was kind of amazing. I remember when I first met Kathy, I was like chatting, and we're cool. And I was like, wait a minute, you're Kathy, Mom? Oh my God. I was so excited to meet you. It was very, very, very cool. So welcome, everybody. And I want to thank Carrie and the ENIGMA team and Pink Concussions for inviting me to be here. Anyone who knows me knows I'm super passionate about this. I will shout from the mountaintops, you name it, because I feel so, I just feel like we can't say enough about this. And getting to the earlier questions, like how to move forward, I basically will strike up a conversation with anybody. And I don't think we're ever too young to learn. And so even kids, learn about this stuff from me. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and go, let's see, I think here, and let's, hold on. I think we're getting there. Uh-oh. Oh, hold on, it went a little, okay, here we go. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I know you have a lot of stuff to do. Everyone is super busy. I mean, it's, I feel like nowadays people are just busier than usual. So thank you so much for tuning in to hear these amazing talks. Yesterday, I was super inspired. It was so exciting to watch the presentations and the panels. And I hope you're in for a big treat today as well. So I talk about, in the title, it says Concussion Plus and Intimate Partner Violence, Understanding the Injuries and Correlates of IPV-related Brain Injury. And I don't know if that's the best term, I mean, I want to come up with something if it's not that. But the reason I like to say Concussion Plus is because I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that when we talk about brain injuries and IPV, we are talking about more than just traumatic brain injuries. And what I mean by that is we're also talking about strangulation-related injuries to the brain. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. I have nothing to disclose monetarily wise, etc. I will say, as has been suggested yesterday and reminded yesterday, that content is not easy to hear at times. I mean, I don't talk, this isn't a fun topic. It may very well be stressful for some, and I do urge people, if this is too much for you, if it triggers, please practice self-care. And I'm always happy to talk with somebody if I can, if I have the bandwidth. As long as there's not too many people, I'm always happy to talk with people afterwards. If they have any questions, you can email me, etc. And unless I don't get it, I will always respond to an email. So I want to start out by just talking a little bit about a real person so people can get a better sense, for people who don't know, about who I'm talking about here when we talk about these women who are experiencing intimate partner violence. Susan, not her real name, was a woman who was in a relationship with a partner, and he basically isolated her, as many abusive partners do. So she was like out in the middle of nowhere, sort of. Then he began smashing her head against door frames, walls, whatever, just for no apparent reason, just because he was in a bad mood. So this was happening on a pretty regular basis. He chased her down with a shotgun on at least one occasion. It may have been more than that. She woke up from being strangled on at least 10 occasions. He threw her off of a porch onto hard, dry clay. She reported feeling woozy probably like a couple times a week for a couple of years from these hits to the head. And later, now this is many years later, she was in a healthy, loving relationship with her partner, and things weren't making sense to her, like things she kind of knew. And it was just scaring her because like she knew people for years and she couldn't remember their names. She was having trouble with conversations. She was forgetting her train of thought. I mean, we all do that, but it was to the point that it was really disturbing and distracting. And then she felt like I have this anxiety, I have panic, and no reason, because I'm in this healthy relationship. She couldn't figure it out. And so this is an example of one woman who reached out to me. And I will tell you, since she has reached out to me, she just happened to be actually the first woman. I've had many, many others reach out to me with similar stories. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Susan at the end, but just so you understand that it's not just, there's just like a couple of people out there. There's a lot of women out there who have these stories that really they're, you know, anyway, I could go on too long right now. So I'm going to try to stay within the time limit. So that's just someone, when we talk about women who have experienced partner violence, an example of somebody we're talking about here. IPV is very simply put, we've been talking about this violence perpetrated by a current or former spouse, partner, significant other, boyfriend or girlfriend. We don't need to go into that too much because I think everyone here knows that. But one of the things that I do want to mention is that it's a leading cause of homicide for women globally. That statistic shocks me every time I say it. The leading cause of homicide for women globally. So if you know, the only thing you know about somebody, a woman, is that she was murdered, and if you know nothing else, your best bet is that it was her current or past partner or a past partner. It won't always be, but that's your best bet. It's also the most common form of violence against women. So for many women, it's much more dangerous for them to be in their own homes than it is for them to walk the streets at night, say New York City, Chicago, etc. And it's found across all socioeconomic boundaries. For anyone who thinks that, oh, white rich people don't have this, or certain people, you know, it's just for those people over there, it's not in my community, I guarantee you, sadly, you're wrong. Okay. The numbers are 1 in 3. 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual partner violence. It varies a little bit about country, by geography. Some women are certainly disproportionately more affected. Some quote unquote marginalized folks are disproportionately affected. But I guarantee you that even if that number goes to 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, unless you know very, very, very few women in your lives, you know somebody. So just think of all the women in your life and think, you know, if you know 9 women, there's a likelihood that 3 of the women that you know have experienced some form of physical or sexual partner violence. I guarantee you, nobody here knows nobody. And I'm not just talking about for people who are working in this field. You know someone in your personal life who's experienced it, but you probably or may not know about it because it's very stigmatizing. These are our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, our colleagues, our partners, our friends. It's all of us, right? I mean, we can't think of this as an other problem. It's not. And so I think that the reason I always want to say this in my lectures is because I want people to feel like this does affect me. Wow, right? And maybe I should check in with my mother or my daughter or my cousin or my aunt because, you know, something doesn't seem, or maybe everything seems great, but maybe I should just check in anyway. And those are the ways, in my opinion, how we're going to make the needle change a little bit, because violence thrives in silence. And the stigma associated with IPV is strong, and people find it uncomfortable. Well, I like to say, get comfortable being uncomfortable. Unfortunately, as we've been discussing in the past couple of days, 80-90% of injuries to women are to the head or neck. I've literally had women telling me being stomped in the head, hit in the head with fists. hit in the head with hammers and struck in the head with baseball bats. I kid you not. And there are worse things too. So if you think about the things that women endure, it's no wonder they may be sustaining brain injuries. And so first I'm going to talk about traumatic brain injury. And I just want to give you this definition. I think a lot of you know a definition of traumatic brain injury, but there's not only one. And in fact, the definition just changed if you go by certain, if you're using the definition that I used way back in 1993, where the Committee on Mild Traumatic Brain Injury, the American Congress of Rehabilitative Medicine, 93 had this definition, but it's actually now a new definition just came out last year, which is slightly different. So all kind of similar, but there are differences. So I just want to tell you the definition that I use for my research, because I do need to tell you about my research because I'm sort of the research person. So basically, for me, the TBI, if it's considered a TBI, it's an external force to the head and disrupted brain function. So what does that mean? It means a hit or jolt or external force to the head that results in any loss of consciousness, even if it's for a second. If you get hit to the head, your head hits something, you're out for a second, that's a TBI. A mild TBI if it's only a second, but it's a TBI, or a concussion. If you have any loss of memory for events immediately before or after the incident, again, that would be a concussion. So you find yourself getting up off the floor after your head was hit, that's a concussion. You don't need a scan to tell you anything. And in fact, a scan probably won't tell you anything. Any alteration in mental state at the time of the incident. So this is where some people disagree a little bit, but this is, I did include this as my definition. So if you get up or if you get hit in the head and you feel really confused, like, where am I? If you want to use the football analogy, sometimes people say, what game are you in, right? How far along are we in the season? For a woman, it may just be she gets up and she's not sure how she got from the bedroom to the bathroom or something like that. But that would be an indication of a concussion. And also any focal neurological deficit. Maybe there may be a seizure, a visual disturbance following that hit, jolt, or external hit to the head. This is how I defined brain injury in my studies. And I would tell you, anyone who wants to know more about how I did the assessment, I can tell you later, but I want to make sure I don't go over and I want to give people time to ask questions. So there's a video that I really love that shows for people who aren't necessarily kind of getting like, well, I don't get it. If you don't see anything, if you can't get through the head, how does it damage your brain? And I don't want to show the video because invariably videos tend to mess up if you're doing something like this. But I just took some screenshots. And basically, this is, again, a TBI describing an external force to the brain and alteration in consciousness or brain function. And if you look at these images, you see that the brain is there and surrounding it, but there's the skull, but you can see there's space in between the brain and the skull. And that space is filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. And that's great because if you're just kind of walking around, it means your brain's sitting there. It's nice and protected. Nothing's going to hit it because you got this hard skull. Things can't penetrate it. The brain, by the way, can be cut with a butter knife. It's super soft. And then you have this cerebrospinal fluid, which helps it float, right? And keeps it kind of cozy and safe. But what happens when you have really strong forces, the skull turns into a weapon against the brain. So in this first one, your head's going smashing against the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe smashing against the front of the skull. And then it ricochets because it's in that fluid. Then it hits the back and the occipital lobe. And if you're hitting the side, it may go to one side and then it may ricochet to the other side. You can see how the brain is moving here, then moving back, side to side. And then the two halves of the brain may be, moving back and forth at a different rate. So these are ways that even though you don't see anything, you can have brain damage or damage to your brain, however you want to put it. So when I started doing this work, I knew what was going on in partner violence, that they were sustaining really bad hits to the head. I knew that if you have brain damage or if you have head injuries, you could have a series of symptoms, et cetera. And when I went to look, there was nothing there. And as we've discussed this morning, thank God now there is a lot more there, but we're still way behind the 8 ball. But let's just, what did I find when I first looked at these data? I interviewed 99 women, and basically what I found in terms of understanding the prevalence of IPV-related brain injury was that the majority of IPV-affected women sustained an IPV-related brain injury. This 42 million here, over here on the right, represents the number of women by that 1 in 3 number in the United States alone that have experienced some form of physical sexual violence in their lifetime over the age of 15. What I found was that 74% of the women in my sample reported at least one brain injury from their partner. Okay. What's even more disturbing was that 51% of women in my sample sustained at least 2. And for a lot of these women, it was simply too many to count. So if you were to look at these numbers and try to translate them, if we were to say how many women sustained repetitive brain injuries from their partners, if we were to extrapolate, which is not epidemiologically correct, but that would equal almost 21.5 million women with repetitive brain injuries from their partners in the United States alone. That is insane to me. Now, I will say, okay, it's a sample of convenience, right? Maybe I'm getting the worst of the worst or whatever. So let's cut this. Let's cut it in half. Let's cut it in quarters. Let's go really low. That's still 5 million women with repetitive brain injuries from their partners. These numbers are astounding. Astounding. So we're not just relying on, that was way back when. And so more recently we said, okay, let's look at whoever has discussed any type of prevalence of brain injury in any paper, like however they did it. Let's see what we get when we look at this. So we did a review, and what we found was that the range was huge. In some samples, and 100% of the women that were interviewed had at least one brain injury. And it wasn't because they were mandating that there had to be a brain injury. It just happened that way. And on the low end, there was 27%. So, and this was across 18 articles. So this is different methodologies, different recruitment, different ways of recruitment, et cetera. And so I still think we need to do the epidemiological work, but we know enough, right? This is very prevalent. This is happening. And what I also found in that paper, in that study with 99 women, that brain injuries, unfortunately, are associated with poor cognitive and psychological outcomes. Higher brain injury scores were associated with poor performance on tests of memory, learning, and cognitive flexibility. And higher brain injury scores were also associated with higher ratings of general distress, depression, worry, anxiety, and traumatic stress. So women are getting sort of a double whammy here, because not only are they having more trouble potentially getting out of bed because maybe they're depressed or worried or leaving the house or doing stuff, but then they kind of can't get it together to balance their checkbook or make the next step in something that they have to do. Imagine how that could potentially impact getting out of an incredibly difficult relationship. And we looked, and these associations were not accounted for by abuse severity for the cognitive functioning, and it was not accounted for by by psychopathology for the cognitive functioning or substance abuse. So it isn't just that women who are being abused by their partners are so psychologically impaired or so traumatized that this is what's causing these problems. We see links between the number of brain injuries and these negative outcomes, independent of these other stressors or issues. So that was a study done in the US, and we wanted to look at this also in Colombia. We used the same brain injury measure, and we found that the prevalence of IPV-related brain injury in Colombia was also high, 31%. I'm not going to get into whether I think it's a real difference or not. The point is this is still high. We're still getting high levels of brain injury in South America now, not just, usually we're in the US or Canada's been great, as Paul and Karen have been leading the force there, and Angela, actually. But now we're going to South America, and we still see this happening. And we show higher brain injury scores are associated with poor performance on, again, long-term and working memory and cognitive flexibility. And then there's a borderline level of association with depression. So we need more replication. We need to find out, if it's measures or whatever that maybe account. I mean, if you want, I don't like comparing these two studies, but people invariably want to. I would say the measures, the specific methodologies are slightly different. So let's not compare it. Let's just say brain injuries are happening and it's bad for everybody. And again, we tried to make sure it wasn't accounted for other things, abuse severity, SES, substance abuse, and we did not we still found the effect even when controlling for those other variables that could potentially inflate that statistic or these associations. So for the next minute, I'm going to try to talk about brain connectivity or communication in a way that I think people can actually understand. I struggled to learn this stuff when I was doing it, and now I do it and I get it. But you know what? I always feel like I just want to do better in helping people to understand this. So any feedback is welcome. But basically, what has been done? Oh, actually, I'm going to start with this. A long time ago, when we were trying to understand what was going on in the brains of people who had sustained brain injuries, we said, what can we do? Usually, if we have people, if it's a mild brain, if there's a moderate to severe brain injury, oftentimes you put them in the scanner and you can see, oh, there's a contusion there, there's a subdural hematoma, there's something going on that you can visually see on the scan. When you just have a quote unquote just concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, you put someone in the scanner, you don't usually see anything. And you can't necessarily, and it was hard to say, okay, if we want to do studies to say, okay, how do we know if this is really having effects? A long time it was like, oh, well, maybe we can use this technique called diffusion imaging, diffusion DTI, diffusion tensor imaging. I don't want to get into all of that, but the point is Dr. Doms O'Connor was talking about diffuse axonal injury yesterday. And she mentioned that in part because, that's what they found. But also, we always had this idea that traumatic brain injuries involve diffuse axonal injury. And what is diffuse axonal injury? It's injury to brain cells that can affect what we call structural or functional connectivity. That's another way of saying it's injury to the brain cells that affect how the brain cells can communicate with one another. Okay. And if we just look over here, we have this is just a neuron. It's a cell in the brain. Here's the cell body, and here's the axon. And this, if you notice, is very thin. The axon's very thin, and it can break. It's microscopic, and it can break pretty easily. It can get torn or shear. And so when you have these tremendous forces to the brain, you can have traumatic shearing of the axon, and that may occur when you have either acceleration, deceleration, or rotational forces. And when you have that, the neuron of the brain cell can be injured such that the neuron cannot communicate with another neuron either effectively or maybe can't even communicate at all. And so what we see in a lot of brain injuries is DAI, diffuse axonal injury. Diffuse, meaning it happens in different parts of the brain. Axonal, it's affecting this axon. This is what's going on here. An injury because it's an injury, so DAI. So that's all it is. So in research, when we wanted to understand what's going on in the brains of football players or athletes, because that's what was being done, people started using imaging, and they were looking at DTI for looking at DAI, or diffuse axonal injury. And so I tried to basically replicate some of what was done in the only literature that was there in women who'd experienced partner violence. And this study, what I found was that IPV-related brain injuries were associated with structural connectivity. What I mean by that is when we looked at, we took a few regions that were shown to be affected in it was a group of football players who had sustained repetitive brain injuries, right? And so I said, okay, can we see that in our women? And right here, there's the posterior and superior coronal radiata. These are the axons. If you look at this beautiful color coding in the brain, this is not what the brain usually looks like. This is what we would call the white matter, or the axons of the brain. And what happens in axons is water flows through the axon. And if the water is flowing along the same direction as the axon is going, then that's considered sort of good in this particular case. If it's kind of flowing more diffusely, like doesn't have a direction, then that's not as good. And we measure that with a certain metric. And what I found was that the more brain injuries a woman had, the lower that metric was, indicating more diffusivity of that water in these two regions. And this was basically replicating, in a way, what was done in football players. Okay. In this next study, we show that brain injuries are associated with functional connectivity or functional or communication, which was associated with memory and learning. So let me say it in a different way. We looked at how well, for various reasons, we know that these two brain regions need to communicate. This is just a schematic, and the brain's kind of cut in half. It doesn't really look like this. But we know that the posterior cingulate and the anterior insula need to communicate with one another, especially during complex tasks. And so we, based on other studies of brain injured folks, we had a hypothesis that the more brain injuries a woman had, the more poorly these two brain regions would communicate with one another. And lo and behold, the more recent and the greater number of brain injuries a woman had, the less positively those two brain regions communicate with one another, similar to what was found in folks who had sustained brain injuries like from car accidents or something. And so what does that mean? Is that meaningful? Well, it actually is, because the less these two brain regions communicated with one another, the worse women tend to be able to learn a list of words and remember that list 20 minutes later. I think we can all agree that it's important to be able to remember and learn on a daily basis, right? So this is meaningful information. You don't need to remember the names of these regions or anything. It's just the idea here is that we show data across the field that we can connect with brain injuries that these women have sustained. And if this can't convince, the people, who are funding or whatever, that this is important, then I don't know what can. Now I'm going to take a second or two and talk about strangulation. This is the plus part of the concussion plus. And why I don't always just say traumatic brain injury, because there's traumatic brain injuries and then there's brain injuries more generally, which includes the brain injuries that may occur as a result of strangulation. Strangulation is one of the most serious forms of abuse, and it can cause what we refer to as an acquired brain injury, something that you're not just born with. Strangulation is not choking. If we're talking with women or we're communicating with women who have experienced partner violence, it is absolutely fine to say he choked me or she choked me. In an academic setting, we want to use the term strangulation because that is correct. Choking is when you have something lodged in your throat. And I think it takes away the sense of severity versus strangulation. So I like to make sure we use the word strangulation. It's an external attack on the neck, external attack on the neck, not something internally lodged. In terms that we often hear when we talk about strangulation are terms like asphyxia, which simply means depriving the body of oxygen, which may, if long enough, lead to unconsciousness or death. And then you hear terms like hypoxia or anoxia. And all that means is either a partial, for hypoxia, loss of oxygen to tissue, or a total anoxia, absence of oxygen to the tissue. Okay. Strangulation is a form of asphyxia from external pressure placed upon the neck, such that there's an obstruction of blood flow either from or to the brain via the jugular or the carotid, or an obstruction of the airway. And so really quickly, when I first started doing this, I thought if someone was strangled, it was the airway, and it was because you couldn't breathe because they were blocking your airway, and that's what caused the problems with strangulation. Well, sure, that is true. But what's even easier to do is if you just press on the sides of the neck, first, what you can do is you can block the jugular. If you do it bilaterally, you block both jugulars. This is taking the dirty, so to speak, the used blood out of the brain and going back to get cleaned, etc. And if you press a little bit, you can block the jugular vein such that you don't have the blood leaving the brain. So now you have blood going into the brain, but nothing leaving. And you can have increased intracranial pressure because there's only a certain amount of space in there, right? And you keep think about if you fill up a balloon too much with water or air, it pops because there's only a limited amount of space and you're putting too much in there. Now, if you also block the carotid artery, you press a little bit harder because the jugulars are a little more lateral. If you block both of these, then you don't have that problem of increased intracranial pressure, but now you don't have that oxygen-rich blood going into the brain. So now you're going to have those terms, anoxia or hypoxia or ischemia. You don't have the nutrients going to the brain regions. And then if you press even harder, you can basically block the airway right here. So blood buildup or lack of enough oxygen from strangulation can cause damage quickly. blood buildup can cause unconsciousness within 2 minutes. Anoxia can cause unconsciousness within 10 seconds. And critically, strangulation can cause brain death in less than 4 minutes while leaving no external mark. Oh my gosh, I have heard stories where a paramedic or someone said, oh, well, you couldn't have been strangled because I don't see anything. Or people say they weren't believed that they were strangled because there were no marks. It's very common. Remember, all you have to do is be pressing on this. It's very easy to do. There are marks and signs that I could tell you about, but I don't have the time to here. But just be mindful that if someone tells you they're strangled and you don't see anything and they felt like it was severe, don't say, oh, well, I can't see anything. It couldn't be that bad. Not true. Damage may result in death even days later because of other complications that happen. They start at the initial point and then they continue until more damage occurs and potential death. Rates of strangulation vary depending on how it's measured, but no matter what you do, the numbers are high. If you just say, as the conflict tactic scale does, and we use that in my studies, did your partner ever choke you, right? 86% of the sample reported that, and this is the sample of 99. And I get similar, I've done other studies, I get similar rates, this much or even higher. And I've looked across studies. This is not an uncommon number. But if I ask in a way where I'm trying to determine if an acquired brain injury occurred from asphyxia or lack of oxygen, I'll ask how I ask my other brain injury questions. After anything your partner ever did you ever lose consciousness, feel dizzy, dazed, confused? And if they say yes to that, and it was because they were strangled, I'll count that. 27% reported at least one alteration in consciousness from strangulation. And I don't know how many other studies have studied this, looked at this way, but I suspect this is not an unusual, I don't think this is necessarily a high number by any means, okay? So what does that mean here? Well, I looked at the data and I did what I did with the in the other study where I was looking at brain injuries and looking at that relationship between cognitive and psychological functioning. And again, I found that strangulation-related alterations in consciousness were associated with poor cognitive and psychological outcomes. Okay, women who experienced alteration in consciousness from strangulation were more likely to have poor performance on tests of both long-term and working memory, and higher ratings of depression and post-traumatic stress. And this was not accounted for by either childhood abuse, which is important because I'll tell you in a minute, or the number of IPV-related traumatic brain injuries as assessed by blunt force, when there was blunt force trauma. So again, these are real things that we need to be worried about, not just blunt force trauma, but also what's going on with strangulation. So women are, in the TBI world, women who are experiencing partner violence, I think are a really, really special group for a lot of reasons. And one of them is because they're much more likely to have different types of brain injuries like this that we're talking about here. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was looking at folks more as a whole. And I think that's really important too. And I don't want us to get too caught up. I mean, I almost hate saying this because I'm so passionate about it and I believe so fervently about it. But I also don't want us to get too caught up in thinking that everything we see in IPV is brain injury, because it's not, right? I mean, there are a lot of other things and we don't want to lose sight of that. In this one study, we looked at correlates of neurobehavioral symptoms in IPV, and we found that childhood abuse was childhood trauma, as measured by the childhood trauma questionnaire, was actually associated with both somatic and emotional symptoms independent of brain injury. Okay. Now, these neurobehavioral symptoms are things that people would usually think of as post-concussive symptoms. But we also found that, that brain injury was associated with somatic and cognitive symptoms independent of childhood trauma. So it's not just one or the other necessarily, and it can be both. And that's what we were finding here. And then in another study, which I think is really interesting, it's basically we're going to submit it soon, but we're finding that individuals who sustained brain injuries in childhood are actually at an increased risk of sustaining partner-related brain injuries. I think that's really fascinating and amazing. I didn't want to put it on a slide because it's not published yet, but there's just a lot more here to think about. A theme that I just see all the time with women who approach me. I mean, it's just women are seeking help. They feel lost, forgotten, undervalued. No one understands them. They've really, to use without a voice is I think what some of the women have said. And so I want us to get a better understanding of what's going on. I can't take too much time because I'm looking at the clock, but I want to say that I'm switching a little bit of gears here from like all the sciencey stuff. I'm going to talk about something else for a little bit. And I want us to understand that women are often trapped in dangerous and terrifying situations. Okay. And for anyone who doesn't fully understand that, I just like throwing up this power and control wheel because it really addresses a lot of the potential things that may be occurring in a relationship with a partner. Intimidation, verbal attacks, isolation, minimizing, using loved ones, threatening. I mean, women are often threatened with their lives. They may be told that their family is going to be killed, their dogs are going to be killed. They may not have money. They may not be able to leave. They may be afraid if they leave, they will be hunted down anyway, etc. So please don't ever ask, why didn't she just leave? I urge you, please. Ask the woman what her situation was like. So one thing that I want to mention is that women are often trapped in dangerous and terrifying situations, which I just said. And unfortunately, in the United States, I don't want us to overlook the increased risk, I will say, to women, in my view, potentially sustaining brain injuries that is driven by things like conservative Supreme Court rulings. As many or all of you probably know, Dobbs versus Jackson overturned both Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania via Casey. And basically what that meant was that states have the right to restrict or prohibit abortion and to enact spousal and partner notification laws. Well, this is not good for women who are experiencing partner violence because, or women in general, really, but let's, I'm not making any judgments, just to say that pregnancy is associated with an increase in intimate partner violence homicide. And we already know that that's the leading cause of homicide for women, IPV. There's also been an association found between abortion access and physical violence. And basically, this leaves women more vulnerable to control by abusers. Reproductive coercion is something that is used by abusers, and that's things like contraceptive sabotage and rape. So you basically put holes in condoms or other things, or you hide her birth control pills or something so that she gets pregnant, and then she's bound to you by a child. And unfortunately, the most vulnerable women to these negative outcomes here are women with limited access to resources, marginalized racial and ethnic groups, low-income groups. And in particular, Black women are 5 times more likely to be murdered in pregnancy or postpartum than white women. And another Supreme Court ruling, but in about a week from that, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin struck down laws on who is permitted to carry firearms in public. The court decided that rules restricting who may carry a gun in public was unduly burdensome for gun owners. Really? Well, at any rate, I will just say that the majority of IPV-related homicides involve firearms. And U.S. women are more likely to be killed by a partner if the partner has access to a gun. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women are at higher risk for IPV homicide than white women. And as I just said in the previous slide again, during pregnancy and postpartum period, Black women have a 5 times higher risk of homicide than white women. So we need to be mindful, not just of talking about silos. We want to be mindful of what's going on in the DV world. We want to be mindful of what's going on in the brain injury world. But we also need to be mindful of what's going on elsewhere that may be placing women at increased risk, because these things increase women's risk for IPV. And then if you're at increase for IPV, you're probably at more risk for severe IPV and certainly brain injuries. And this is just one other state court ruling where the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the FDA. The Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine argued that FDA did not allow for enough research and testing for mifepristone, sorry, I'm tongue-tied, which is the quote-unquote abortion pill or whatever. Yet approval took 4 years and it's been thoroughly tested in both the US and France. 23 years since initial approval, and there have been tens of thousands of patients in the US and Canada showing it's safe and effective. And it's clearly a superior alternative to early abortion and miscarriage care. So we need to be mindful of these things because these things all, weave together to create a more negative, or I mean, I don't want to be sounding like too much of a Debbie Downer here, but a negative situation for women who are in unsafe situations. The other thing I want to mention is I've been talking a lot about, obviously, because that's what we're here to talk about, IPV and brain injury. And what we mainly know so far, as Willie can attest to, and anybody here really probably, but the people, we know a lot more about, and still not a lot, but a lot more about what happens in sports and brain injury. And we've learned from sports certain things like what are the risk factors for brain injury and recovery from brain injury. And one of them is acute management of brain injury. That's a big one. What's going to help you recover if you deal with that brain injury right away? Well, unfortunately, as we heard yesterday, many of these brain injuries go completely unnoticed. There's no management. So if you're not managing it, you're really at a increased risk for potentially sustaining another brain injury or not recovering from that as quickly as you would otherwise. If you have a history of previous brain injury, there's evidence to suggest that your recovery will take a little bit longer. Well, as I said, many of these women have sustained repetitive brain injuries from their partners. And other bodily injuries or health risks may make it longer for your brain injury to recover because your body has so many resources, right? It has so many things that can, it helps, like your body's trying to recover itself or heal itself, et cetera. And if your body has to heal a broken leg or a broken jawbone or something like that, that's going to take some energy away. And so that actually decreases, potentially, it's associated with, poor recovery. Psychological stress, acute intense stress, and general life stress, all of which I think are generally higher in women who are experiencing partner violence, especially if they're sustaining brain injuries. All of these things are going to impinge negatively on recovery from brain injury. And finally, yes, men and folks across the gender spectrum absolutely sustain brain injury, and I'm sure sustaining TBIs, and Carrie's group presented some data to that effect yesterday, and we're collecting some data as well about transgender individuals. But I've studied females mostly, and the little data that we have on females is that females tend to recover more poorly from concussions. We don't know if it's from the weaker neck muscles, the smaller axons, et cetera. But if you look at this list here, women who are experiencing IPV are really on the poor end of the spectrum of recovery from brain injury. So it's really important that we recognize brain injury when it occurs so that we can intervene as soon as possible so that we can help versus have these, basically the effects of brain injuries persist if that's what happens. And so what can we do? I'm going to start being a Debbie upper instead of a Debbie downer here. And as we talked about yesterday, oh my gosh, start the conversation. I don't care if you're uncomfortable. We're going to talk about this. And as we also mentioned, COVID with a silver lining, I was able to write this, article. I don't think I would have gotten this published if it weren't for COVID, but I took the opportunity of COVID and said, you know what? Gendered violence is going up. And then I said, I wrote to the editors, when I wrote this paper, and I said, you know what? We know, you can see across the globe that violence is going up as COVID glows around the globe, but people aren't talking about traumatic brain injuries. They're talking about the violence, but not the brain injuries. And so I was able to get this in. And we have to find little avenues like that to do that. Keep in mind the high likelihood of IPV-related brain injury or strangulation may have occurred in any woman or any individual that you may know who's experiencing partner violence. Has the right question been asked, a woman will not necessarily know that she sustained a TBI. Absolutely. And she may not recognize it's important. Like, why should I bother telling somebody I hit my head and I was unconsciousness? I have a broken arm to fix, or maybe I don't want the judge to know because I'm going to get in trouble and they're going to take my kids, which is a whole nother story. And as I think hopefully everyone here knows, a negative scan does not mean that there's no TBI, because typically if it's a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion, unless it's a complicated one, you're not going to see anything. Most scans are going to show, your brain looks pretty good. I think there may be some new fancy scans that may be coming out, but anyway, we'll go with what you're typically going to get in the ED. And women rarely report that they sustained a TBI and may not report being strangled. And these are things that they might say, he hit me, and then I was getting up off the floor. So maybe, right there, if you hear that, was she knocked out? Is that what she's trying to say? I don't remember how I got from the bathroom to the bedroom. What does that mean? So to a police officer, that might just mean, oh, you were too stoned or drunk or jacked up. Ooh, that one was a doozy. Well, what do you mean by doozy? He pinned me against the wall and hit my head. His hands were on my neck, and I was afraid he was going to kill me. Now, all of these do not mean necessarily that there's a brain injury. But if anyone said any of this to me, I would absolutely follow up and make sure that I knew whether or not there was. Brain injuries unseen behind closed doors are unfortunately likely to be misinterpreted or missed. Because if you have a brain injury, you might disoriented, confused, distractible, inconsistent, maybe have a headache, you're uncooperative, you're dizzy, you're off balance. What does that look like to you? If I saw someone like that, unless I saw them on the football field, as I do, and they get up and they look all off balance and dizzy, I might say, oh, that guy's got a brain injury. Wow, he just got a concussion. In fact, I know I saw 2 last week watching, and none of them, by the way, were, one was noted, but whatever. But it's like, oh yeah, they just had a brain injury. But if I walk, if I'm walking down the road and I see someone walking like this, or I just come across somebody, I'm going to think, oh wow, what's that person on? That person might be drunk. Well, that's what it's not what I try to think anymore because I know better, but that's what I think a lot of people think. And I kind of don't blame you. If you don't see the brain injury happening, this looks a lot like intoxication. So we need to be very, very careful. TBIs can make it harder for a woman to survive, escape, or keep her children. It may make it harder to assess danger, defend herself, remember safety plans, go to school, remain financially dependent on the partner, leave the abusive partner and live on her own or access necessary services, adapt to living in a shelter, as was referred to earlier. It's a shelter. It can be very difficult if you have a brain injury, but it's still going to be better than being with your partner. But shelter folks need to understand why you may seem non-compliant, et cetera. But one thing I always want to say is it does not mean that you're unfit. You know what? I sustained a brain injury because I was playing with my kid. Don't need to know the details, but it was mild, whatever, but it was a concussion. And no one was there saying they're going to take my kid away from me, right? So just because you have a brain injury doesn't mean that you're unfit, right? There may be other things, but that in and of itself is a ludicrous argument. So and when we're thinking of the legality of things or court cases or whatever, we need to be prepared for defense attorneys or defendants to say, oh, if she's got a brain injury, she can't do this. And we need to have an argument to that. We just need to be prepared if we're going to use this. And in some cases, maybe we say, well, we know this, we're going to share this with the woman, but maybe we won't share it with the legal team. That's too much to go into right now, so I'll just leave it at that. We want to interact with women in a way that is sensitive to the possibility of a brain injury. These are just a couple of examples. I have many more, but the point is there's so much you can do without having any degree or knowing really anything. You just say, okay, what's going to make this easy? You minimize distractions, meet in a quiet location, take short meetings, take breaks, avoid loud noises or bright lights, repeat information, use journals or checklists or notepads. Prioritize goals. If you've just had a brain injury, you may not think maybe it's more important to do like this tiny little thing versus this big thing you need to get done because you just don't necessarily prioritize right. Talk slowly, much more slowly than I am right now, and to the point, and double check to make sure that she got the information. Because if you blah, 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 okay, see you next week. Maybe she didn't get any of it. So she comes back next week. She doesn't have anything. So make sure. And there's a lot more we could go there. But the point is you can get this information and it can be tremendously helpful with very little training. And so who do I think needs to know this? Everyone knows. I think absolutely everyone needs to know. We need to raise awareness everywhere. I try to allude to certain folks within this lecture. Every woman should know. first responders, including police and paramedics. They can interpret and understand the situation correctly. A judge can see, wow, well, she's not making any sense, but it's not just because she's, you know, a druggie or something. Maybe she sustained a brain injury, right? And IPV support staff. You know, I've had women, IPV support staff say, oh my, I'm seeing this one woman in a totally different light now. I know she must have had brain injury. So it really helps. Your perception is huge. It's not necessarily the reality, it's the perception. And that can be changed tremendously. And affected women themselves. I can't tell you how many people have said, you're my savior. No one has believed me. No one, I finally understand what's going on. And maybe, at the time they don't know why they can't do certain things. They may not be able to feel like they can successfully get out of the relationship. And as Dr. Dons O'Connor and others have said, we don't know about the long-term effects. We don't know. I have been saying now for a long time, I don't think it's CTE. I really don't, for a number of different reasons, but I do think it's something. I don't think that people can sustain many, 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 many brain injuries and then have absolutely no negative repercussions eventually. But I don't know that yet because we haven't done the research. So Kristen's data showed that things don't look good, and we don't know exactly what the story is, but we need to study it. But let's not assume that everything is peachy keen. But if we know what we're dealing with, we're in a much better position to deal with it and just manage it. And so I'm just going to swing back to Susan really quickly. The woman I told you about earlier, she discovered articles on the link between IPV and brain injury, noticed the symptoms she was experiencing were the same ones that IPV-related brain injuries were associated with. She reached out to leaders in the field like me. Now she is happy. She's living a great life. She knows to adjust her schedule if she becomes overwhelmed. She travels as a speaker for Pink Concussions and an ambassador for the PB task force. Catherine knows her very well, as some of you all on this call. And basically this knowledge has been life-changing. So no, we cannot fix necessarily a brain injury or a history of brain injuries, but we absolutely can do things to make the lives of the people who have sustained them better. And then I just say we want to create opportunities and inspire empathy and action in the next generation. We've had questions about what do we do? You know what? I say, let's go to our youth. You know, we're some of us are old and tired and maybe don't have the energy, but my 13-year-old niece started this Beads for Hope program when she was 13. And now she's a sophomore in Princeton and the program's still going on. I give one of these bracelets out to every woman. Whenever I give a talk, anyone, I bring a bunch of them and people can come up and take them free of charge. And it's got a beautiful note that says, I made this bracelet for you so that you can remember that you're deserving of beauty, recognition, and hope. And I give them out to all my participants. And then my son was challenged when he was like 8 or 9 years old. Here he is on the PIBI task force, the International PIBI task force, giving a presentation and PowerPoint that he did all by himself, mind you. He advocated they had to do a fundraiser in school. And he said, I want to do Pink Concussions because women should not be hurt. And he got it. And so they were supposed to raise maybe $30. He raised over $300 and then gave this presentation about it. So let's not discount the young ones. And I don't think it's too young. You know, he's known about what I do for a very long time. I don't want to be like, oh, I don't want to scare him because no. It's the reality, it's life, it's all around us. They need to know, and the sooner the better. And we want to raise our children so that from the start, they know that relationships are not necessarily safe, but how to have a safe one. And with that, I will close. IPV-related brain injuries are very common, they're very dangerous, and I firmly believe it is our job, each and every one of us, to recognize and intervene. And I implore all of you who have listened to this today, just do one little thing today. Doesn't have to be a big thing. Talk to your mother, anybody, and just say anything about intimate partner violence and brain injury. Anything, just that it exists, something. And if you do that, I will be eternally grateful. Thank you so much. Stop sharing my screen. And questions?
Thank you, Dr. Valera, for that fantastic talk. You covered so many different issues. I'm just wondering, you mentioned the things that we can do. What do you think are the most important things or ways that the field has to move now?
What was the ways?
The
And it just-
ways that our field has to move forward. You mentioned a whole bunch of them that I think are absolutely necessary. But would you add any more to that? Would you? I'm wondering, not just about the research, but Dr. Nemeth before in the previous panel talked about getting the community involved, and the statement, nothing about us without us. And I think that's an important piece. What would you add to that?
I mean, I mean, there's so like we've been discussing, there's so many different levels. We're starting. I mean, there's good and bad, right? The bad thing is we're so low on the spectrum of making progress and change that there's a lot of areas to improve on. So I think what I would say is if you're good at something, you say, okay, how can this potentially influence what we know about IPV and TBI? So for example, if you're in the political arena, address it in that capacity, whatever you're good at. So I mean, and like if you're in education, advocate for a course in that second and third graders get, or that just wherever. The educational system should be teaching about healthy relationships. Very few do. There are some systems that have a course and they, that's what they take all the time. And that's what we all need, because children need to learn what a healthy relationship is, and not just for people who are perpetrating abuse, or as the VA might say, using abuse, which I personally I'm crazy about, but women themselves, or people who are experiencing the abuse. Because I've had people say, well, I didn't want to have sex with him. I didn't want to do this, or he only did this. I don't know. Is that really abuse? Yes. No, you should not have to have sex with someone if you don't want to. You don't owe that person anything, right? And so I mean, I think that, if like for me, I really like the idea of prevention, sort of starting it at the root when people are young. And if we can get everybody, that's going to be huge. And if we put it in the school system, in theory, everyone should get it, because we can't rely on parents to do this. Parents may not know, and they're certainly basically presenting bad behaviors to their children when abuse is going on. But otherwise, I would say, think about what you're good at. What is there a certain thing you're passionate about, and how can you use that to get into that, to make changes in the IPV? Because look at the legislation I talked about in this presentation. I mean, that's just not good. That's not going to help IPV. That's not going to help women who are experiencing more severe violence. I was horrified.
The legislation appears to be going backwards instead of forward.
So that's just, there's just lots of different ways. And if you're in the ED or something, right? I mean, there you just need to go to the director, whoever the head person is, and say, whenever people come in, we should really do a quick screen for brain injury and have a place to send them. Because we also published another study recently and in Australia, and even if people were, sort of recognized as having a brain injury, not necessarily, because it was systematic, but they weren't necessarily sent for the very few were sent for a brain injury referral. So it's sort of like somebody might say, oh yeah, brain injury, never mind, so I think that wherever you are, say, okay, how can we make brain injuries more obvious here? What are the questions we're going to ask? And just start doing that. I don't know if that's too vague, but that's my answer.
And then I think also setting up the resource and support in the community for that brain injury recovery, as you mentioned before. Maybe this is just goes on the tail end of what you just said, but why do you think it's so hard to set that up? Is it just because people don't think that TBI in this population is a non-starter?
Well, I don't think people have thought about, the powers that be, so to speak, haven't really thought about TBI in this population at all. Treatment, well, I think when it comes to brain injury, I think in general, and other people might be able to speak to this better, treatment's not necessarily that good. There's like, sometimes it's like brain injury survivors may flounder, especially if it's a mild traumatic brain injury. And it sort of depends if you get to the right person. And again, it's not like there's like a pill you can take. So I think people don't really like dealing with it, but I don't know as much about that. At any rate, I'll just say that I don't think that like we've been saying the past couple of days, IPV-TBI just hasn't really been recognized. And until it's recognized, we're certainly not going to be in a position to deal with it.
Right, right. Well, I think that concludes this portion. I'm going to give it back to Dr. Estezenko. And again, thank you for this wonderful, informative presentation. We appreciate all of your work.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Always a fantastic talk, Dr. Valera. We are heading to a break. There is one more question in the Q&A for you if you want to stay and answer it. If not, we can head to break and you can answer it, type in, but totally up to you. It's what recommendations do you have to help move the needle at a policy and or systems level? I don't know if you want to type that one back or if you want to share your thoughts, but
I mean, well, part of it is, I mean, I guess, well, I mean, I think we are a little bit actually, if we're going to talk about getting government involved, and because I think we are, like the CDC is coming to us and asking for ways to get this into their epidemiological research and trying to understand brain injuries and IPV. So I think that's good. I think, I don't know if that's the right, if that's exactly the question, but engaging as much as we can with people who make the rules, people who have these big epidemiological, the power and abilities to do these big epidemiological studies, and people who have the money. So NIH is one of the biggest funding sources. So if we can get the government's attention, just like up in Canada, Paul and Karen have been fabulous in getting the government's attention, and they've gotten amazing resources, which is just awesome. And they work so hard at that. So yeah, I don't know if that's the best answer, but that's what I got.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to let you know that in the chat, there are some questions in there you might want to wander through when you have a chance and give an answer if you have a few minutes after. But to everybody else, we are taking a break. We will be back here at 2:05 Eastern time. Come back at 2:05 Eastern and we will continue with our trainee data blitz. And again, thank you, Dr. Valera, for joining us and giving such an inspired talk. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.